right? So everybody's laughing because I'm stupid, and it was pointed out to me about 5 or 10 minutes in that I wasn't recording. I didn't even have the iPhone on the mic stand and in the holder. So here we are, well into the lecture, and I'm going to have to go back and start over. So these people that are here today, they'll have a leg up on you because they'll know the first few slides really, really well. We're talking about what happens when worlds collide. So they've just heard all this. We're talking about the European discovery, if you will, quote unquote discovery of the New World, an accidental discovery, but one that eventually leads to what they would characterize as an age of exploration of the Americas, a part of the world that these Europeans did not know existed. And that eventually leads, in many cases, to expeditions of conquest, conquering Native Americans so that their stuff could become your stuff, and especially their land, or any mineral wealth that you could gain from that land. So we're going to talk about that and the implications of that, but we're also going to talk about an ecological and biological process known by the extraordinarily misleading title of the Columbian Exchange. A title which I would not use except for the fact that your textbook uses it in the title of the comparative essay, The Columbian Exchange. So, we began by getting a little bit of European context here. You'll recall from previous lectures that Europe was experiencing in the 1300s crisis, the crisis of the Black Death, a pandemic that killed 30 million people, the crisis of the 100 Years' War, which killed many people and caused great disruption, including economically. But Europe enters the 15th century stronger and has a sort of comeback, if you will. And most important for our purposes today, Europe has a growing, what we would call nowadays, middle class. That is a larger number of people who are not necessarily filthy rich kings or lords, but also not like poor peasants. These are people who have money to spend on the nicer things of life as opposed to just life's necessities. So you have a reinvigoration of what was sometimes called the spice trade. Another misleading name because it's not just about spices. Let me get a better angle here. But yes, spices. So, since we have you enlightened few here who have already heard this, what were some of the spices I rattled off? Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, sugar even, something so simple as sugar. These were exotic things to Europeans that they didn't have, they didn't grow and cultivate, that they got from places like India and China, and from the so-called Spice Islands of Indonesia. But this is where we were when it was so politely and delicately pointed out to me that I was not recording. It's more than just spices. So look at, from China, silks. Silk was such an important commodity that had traditionally been imported into Europe from what they would call the Far East, that this series of trade routes that runs through Central Asia, through today the countries of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan and so on, and through the Middle East and through the city of Baghdad, which we've talked about. That series of trade routes is known as the Silk Road. This is my favorite. Drugs. And we would think today about like the trafficking of drugs from Latin America, like cocaine or meth, that are produced here, in fact. But this, I think, refers especially to opium. And perfumes and fineries like porcelain coming from China. From India, various spices and sugar, precious stones like jade, and cotton, so textiles. Spices from the islands of Indonesia. There's even trade with East Africa here, and cities like Zanzibar, Mombasa. And from out of East Africa came gold and ivory. Later we'll talk about the slave trade. But look at this map. This is important. Now there were overland routes like especially the Silk Road, right? But there's seaborne routes too, right? Up the Persian Gulf, up the Red Sea. But look at, there are also what we might call choke points, right? All of this stuff passes through this area here, which all of this, all of North Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, what we call the Middle East, Turkey, for centuries had been part of a great Arab Muslim empire. It is ruled over by different people at different times, but it has been there for a long, long time, going back even to the days of the Prophet Muhammad, founder of Islam himself. At this time, the rulers were the Ottoman Turks, so this is known as the Ottoman Empire. All that stuff's passing through the Ottoman Empire. And what happens to these trade goods when they go through the Ottoman Empire and they change hands? Or what could happen? Could be taxed, right, by the Ottoman Empire. Or even if they're not taxed and they pass hands from one merchant to the next, everybody's out to make a profit, right? So once it gets into the hands of merchant number 3, what's happened to it? It costs more. Then it makes its way into the Mediterranean Sea, and we have another choke point, Italy. The city-states of northern Italy are these great ports. Ports of, in this case, importation. And then exportation overland and by sea to places like Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, and Germany. In other words, before all these goods get to Spain, Portugal, France, Britain, Germany, and so on, they've changed hands a number of times. They've been funneled through the Ottoman Empire and through the city-states of northern Italy, which means by the time they get into the hands of consumers in those places, price has been jacked up big time. Does that make sense? And so people begin to ask themselves in those kingdoms that are becoming those modern-day nation-states, what if there's another way? What if we could cut out the middlemen? What if we could somehow cut out Italy and the Ottoman Empire and establish direct connections with India, China, and the Spice Islands? Among the first people to really systematically ask and seek the answer to that question are the Portuguese. If we had a map that showed us, and maybe we do, and I'm jumping ahead in terms of content, but if you look at this map, mid-1400s it would cut off about here in terms of what Europeans knew existed. In other words, for our purposes right now, they knew about North Africa. They knew there was a giant-ass desert here, the Sahara. They had explored the coast over here and here, but they didn't know how far down it went or how big it was. And so it's the Portuguese who are among the first to systematically seek out the extent of the African continent and to explore the question of could we possibly sail south and around. If we could do that, they say, we could establish perhaps a direct connection with India, Indonesia, and China. We just have to find out voyage after voyage, and it might take years, and it might take technological or intellectual advancements, but we might find out that we have the ability to do this. Among those most interested in this is a Portuguese prince named Henry, the son of the Portuguese King John, who had himself been quite interested in perhaps exploring and conquering parts of North Africa and tapping into the trans-Saharan trade. So I wish I had a topographical map of Africa. You know what? This is what I do this in World 1 to the point I think they get annoyed. We go, it's like Dr. B's Google Earthing. We just go Google Earthing all the time. I sometimes find that perhaps really sadly late at night when I'm just sitting there at my desk having a drink, like I'll just go explore. Because I don't have any actual money to actually travel, which we couldn't do right now even if we wanted, right? You said that's not sad?
That's not sad.
Okay, I appreciate that.
That's normal. I do that too.
Excellent. All right. It's not just me then. So here's Portugal, neighbor kingdom of Spain. And here's Africa. So I'm going to do satellite view. So the North African Mediterranean coast is fertile. and had long been home to Berbers and Arabs of the Muslim faith, and is kind of part of the Arab world. And then you have Egypt over here, and the Nile is one of the hubs of civilization from the very beginning. And then there's the largest desert on earth, the Sahara Desert. And then there's sub-Saharan Africa, which is like a world apart. And Europeans were aware that down below the Sahara somewhere, these North Africans traded with folks down here through various routes, like through the city of Timbuktu here in the middle of the desert. But they knew there were traditional kingdoms down here like Mali and Ghana and Oyo and Dahomey and Senegambia and so on, some of which were quite wealthy, and there was a lot of gold that made its way up through those Saharan trade routes. And then there's even legend that because white people couldn't conceive of like black Africans having a huge wealthy civilization, they of course have to invent this narrative of, well, there's all this gold down there. It actually comes from, there's a white Christian king down there, Prester John. There's this legend of the King Prester John, who's supposedly this white Christian king in sub-Saharan Africa, which is of course a total fabrication, a complete myth. But the point is that Prince Henry's father, King John of Portugal, is obsessed with that idea. And so Henry is sort of raised up in this royal family and court that's particularly interested in what's going on down here. Does that make sense? And so he surrounds himself with seafarers, explorers, cartographers or map makers, technicians and craftsmen, and establishes what you might call a school of seafaring. I mean, not a school like you can roll in and take classes, but he just surrounds himself with intellectuals and technicians who study, how to build better ships, how to navigate out in the ocean more effectively, how to create better maps, most especially of Africa. And out of that quote-unquote school of seafaring comes some new navigational equipment using the tools, in fact, of astronomy, studying the position of the sun and the moon and the stars in the sky, that especially allow seafarers to better calculate latitude. That is where you are north and south. Always remember latitude is like a ladder, north and steps of a ladder. This is really important if your goal is to find the tip of Africa. You weren't going to do that in one voyage. The African continent is massive. And you could only go out for maybe a couple of months at a time. So what you would do is you would sail down to the point at which you knew you had gone farther than ever before. And these new tools allow you to do that because you can better calculate your latitude. And then you would turn east, right, and see, do we hit the African coastline again? And if we do, we know we haven't made it around, and then one day we won't, right? Supposedly. So having new tools like the astrolabe and the quadrant that your book talks about, I think, that's important for navigating and especially calculating latitude. And then perhaps the most important thing to come out of this school of seafaring is the caravel. A relatively small ship, but one that's big enough to carry the kind of supplies you would need for like a months-long journey. But importantly, too, that despite being just big enough for that, it is highly maneuverable compared to what they'd had before. It uses lateen sails as opposed to just square rig sails that allow you to sail against the wind. They're not just being dependent upon the winds to go where you're going to go, but being able to sail perhaps into the wind using these newly designed sails. And also, because it's kind of compact and has that maneuverability, you could sail this vessel close to the coastline and not just be worried every moment you're going to get thrown up against the rocks and the ship wrecked. So it's ideal for specifically these kinds of voyages. Later, when Christopher Columbus sails west, it'd be in these kind of ships. So the Portuguese then begin undertaking voyage after voyage down the West African coastline, mapping that out and establishing along the way trading forts. They never venture into the African interior. They would have met with stiff resistance and probably disease too. And so what they do is they establish little forts that they leave on the coast, and they establish trading relations with local African nations and kingdoms. At this point, that's primarily trading for things like ivory and gold that are in abundance, especially in West Africa. This is, however, a little bit of foreshadowing, because within about 100 years, those trading forts are going to become slaving forts. But we're not quite there yet. Eventually, the Portuguese do make it around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa. The Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama. Let's see if you can see this. I think it's two M's. Makes it around the Cape of Good Hope and establishes connections with East Africa and then eventually India too. So they've done it by that point. They have achieved that goal. But that's 1498. What year did Christopher Columbus sail west? 1492. So they did it, but Columbus had already set sail for the west. So obviously, by the time the Portuguese have achieved this of getting into the Indian Ocean and establishing direct connection with the east, other people have begun to argue or wonder, well, what about another way? In other words, could you sail west to get to the east? You guys ever heard of the Mandela effect? So that's like, apparently at some point a bunch of people, for one reason or another, began to believe that Nelson Mandela, the great leader of independent black South Africa, had died in prison, which is very clearly not true, because he gets out and becomes president, as we'll see later in this class. So they use that name, the Mandela effect, to refer to instances of where people just, for whatever reason, like people all over the place, believe in something that just is not true. Here's an example. I have found that a lot of people believe that Christopher Columbus was some radical thinker because he was like the only guy in the world, or the first person to think the world was round. This is not true. In the 1490s, anybody associated with seafaring, anybody associated with the Portuguese efforts, anybody who is an educated person at a royal court, anybody that was in, maritime trade, all of these people, anybody that was a part of a budding or emerging science, astronomy, all these people figured the world was round. Now, nobody had outright proved it yet, but people more or less knew the world was round. So that is not the reason Columbus has trouble getting funding for his voyage west to try to make it to China. What is the reason then? Why are people reluctant to fund this man? He is an Italian, after all, who ends up sailing for Spain and who gets shot down a number of times. Again, we go back to this map, which looks like primitive and crappy, but it serves to prove a really good point. Again, this is what Europeans know exists. Most of Asia, China, India, the Middle East, of course Europe itself, and North and coastal Africa. And this represents what most people who had done the math figured to be the size of the earth. But note what is not in white. All the Americas, North, South, Central America, they did not know that existed. And so, if you figure you know the size of the earth, but you don't know that's here, and you have a guy saying, I'm going to set sail from here, go all the way around and get here, you're looking at this guy and going, dude, with those ships and the supplies that you can take, you're going to get to about right here, and you're all going to be dead out in the middle of the ocean. That makes sense? Because they don't know this is there. They figure that's all ocean. So nobody will throw away their money to Christopher Columbus to just go die out in the middle of the ocean, months journeys away out in the middle of nowhere. Does that make sense? So it's the matter of distance that's at issue here, not the matter of the earth being round or flat. It's that Columbus thought he had the right calculations of the size of the circumference of the earth and figured he could get to what he thought would be over here before he ran out of supplies. And other people are telling him, no, it's further than you think, right? And he was wrong. They were right. He was wrong. But he successfully pitches his voyage to the first king and queen, the co-rulers of the brand new kingdom of Spain. The kingdom of Spain was created upon the joining of the kingdoms of Aragon and Castile with the marriage of Fernando and Isabella. If you had asked King Fernando and Queen Isabella upon their deathbeds, what was your great achievement in life? They perhaps would have pointed to the year 1492, but not because they had funded some Italian explorer from Genoa to sail west. They would have said, we completed the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Western Christian world. So, I've mentioned the existence from the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula through North Africa of a great Arab Muslim empire going back centuries. Going back to the 700s, Arab Muslim armies had conquered not just North Africa, but crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, conquered most of the Iberian Peninsula, including what would later become Spain and Portugal, and almost crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into France, only to be finally defeated by a French king. They eventually get pushed back through much of the northern part of the Iberian Peninsula, but there they remained in the south for hundreds of years. And Spanish kings and queens and princesses had to chip away at Arab territory in the south of Spain. In 1492, the very last of those Arab princes resides here at the city of Granada in his palace castle known as the Alhambra. In 1492, Fernando and Isabella defeat him and drive him out. That is the last Muslim ruler to live in and rule on the Iberian Peninsula, and he is driven out in the name of Christendom. And so in the eyes of Fernando and Isabella, they have completed that reconquest of Europe and the West from Muslim rulers. Never mind the fact, as we'll see, that the Ottoman Turks are invading at that very moment southeastern Europe, almost all the way into Austria and Germany. Fernando and Isabella are just concerned with their own backyard. Remember, too, when I talked about the Reformation last time, I noted that, in addition to Italy itself, where, Rome is, that Spain remains like the most Catholic, right, of all nations, of all kingdoms in this case. And they took pride in that. They consider themselves the Christian monarchs. And so this is their thing. Well, what does this have to do with Columbus other than the 1492 coincidence? It's the same year. When Columbus comes to them and says, I'm going to sail west to get east, and I'm going to go and make contact with these people in East Asia, they see this as an opportunity to spread the Christian faith, the Catholic Christian faith. That Columbus, even though he didn't really give a shit about this, would be an ambassador for the Catholic faith. And yeah, he's not Spanish, but he's Italian. Next best thing, right? He's a good Catholic guy. 2, consider who Spain's next door neighbor is and what they are at that moment in the process of doing. It's a little bit of keeping up with the Joneses, keeping up with your next door neighbor rival kingdom, thinking if they're going to establish perhaps these direct connections with India and maybe more, we might take a chance on having our own direct connections, even if it means giving this, crazy Italian guy some money. So it's a little bit of, perhaps allowing Columbus to be a missionary for the Catholic faith, a little bit of keeping up with Portugal. But they're the ones that fund Columbus, and he sets sail in 1492, and his men are on the verge of mutiny, thinking that other people were right and Columbus was wrong about the circumference of the earth. They had not sighted land in months. When finally they do indeed lay eyes on the coastline of an island in the Bahamas, known to the native peoples as Guanahini, but named by Columbus San Salvador. the exact location of which I do not think we know, but would be somewhere in the general vicinity of here. The Bahamas, not far from Florida. And so Columbus begins sailing around these various islands, convinced that he has made it to the Indies, to Indonesia, which is why he refers to the Tainos and the Caribs as Indians, right? He writes in his journal things like, yeah, I think tomorrow we're going to sail north a little bit and see if we can find Japan, because he believes he is on the other side of the earth. And he's terribly confused because this is supposed to be the land of spices and fineries and wealth, and yet these people that he encounters, the Tainos and the Caribs, are an agricultural people who do a lot of fishing and barbecuing local fowl and growing corn and the like, and they, in his mind, they're running around half naked and seem to have no religion at all, even though that wasn't the case. And so he's very confused. And yet he sees that some of them have like little gold jewelry, and he's seeing his journal, he's always like, we asked him, where do we find that? Where do we find that? Where can we find that? And initially on his first voyage, they're more or less getting along despite the obvious problems of communication. Caribs, by the way, is from whence we get the word Caribbean for this area. But he goes back and he presents the king and queen with an account of his travels. Definitely wants to note that gold. Wants to note that these people in his mind have no religion and could be easily converted to Christianity. And he, again, doesn't much care about that, but he knows they do, and it's their money. He says, you got to send me back. I got to go back. And he goes back several more times, and he explores not just the islands of the Bahamas, but also Cuba, Hispaniola, where today Haiti and the Dominican Republic are, other islands of the Caribbean, makes contact with the mainland of Central America and Mexico. The Spanish eventually will send permanent settlements to occupy parts of the island of Cuba and establish that as a sort of base of further exploration. Columbus dies having again thought that he was all the way over here, right? But it's up to another guy, a cartographer named Amerigo Vespucci, who at times worked for both Spain and Portugal, who was on expeditions that explored further east from where Columbus had explored. And they keep following this coastline of South America, down and down and down and down. And like, holy shit, this never ends. And they eventually do get to where it rounds around out here, and they're following down, down, and down. And it's Amerigo Vespucci that goes, wait a minute, I'm a cartographer. I've mapped out this whole area over here, and there ain't a damn thing over here that is the size of this that I'm aware of. So it's Vespucci who begins to acknowledge the fact that this is not the East, this is a new world. And that's why it ends up being named for Amerigo Vespucci, the Latin of Amerigo being Americus. So America, the Americas, are named for Vespucci and not Columbus, because he's the guy that realized it was a new world. It's the Portuguese, by the way, that end up colonizing Brazil here. The Spanish will explore and colonize other parts of South America and Central America. But it's while they are establishing themselves on the island of Cuba that they begin to hear rumors of a great and powerful empire on the mainland. They've begun to realize, okay, there are islands out here and there's some sort of larger landmass here. And we're hearing rumors that there is a very powerful and indeed very wealthy empire that exists here somewhere. And they want to find out about that. So if I skipped over this, Columbus's accidental discovery and this promise of a new world, once Vespucci and otherwise begin to realize that's what it is, inspires a whole generation of explorers and would-be conquerors known in the Spanish realms as conquistadores. who are motivated by what you might call the 3 G's: God, gold, and glory. God, and that they would be missionaries for the Spanish faith, which would please their king and queen, which would be quite glorious, would it not? And if you engage in conquest, that's all very glorious for the kingdom of Spain or the kingdom of Portugal, to fight under the flag of your kingdom, your country. But make no mistake, the most important of those 3 G's is the one in the middle: gold. They begin to hear rumors that that empire in Mexico was one of great, great wealth, including of mineral wealth, and most especially gold. And eventually gold in the New World will come to represent anything of great value: gold or silver, or perhaps just the land itself. That becomes the primary motivation for voyage after voyage after voyage. And I mentioned, while they are establishing themselves on Cuba, the Spanish will train up a military expeditionary force under the command of a young conquistador named Hernan Cortez. And they will send Cortez onto the Mexican mainland in search of this great empire. And he will land in 1519 at Veracruz, here. Indeed, in the territory of the empire of the Mexica people, from whence we get the name Mexico, otherwise known as the Aztecs. One of 2 great Native American civilizations to exist at that time. Now, further south and to the east, in years past, in the Yucatan Peninsula and down towards Guatemala, there had existed a great civilization of city-states known as the Maya, or the Mayans. They have declined by this point. So if the Aztecs are one, the Mayans have declined, who further south would represent the other great Native American empire? In Peru, in the Andes Mountains. The Incas. We'll get to them in a minute. Back to the Aztecs, though. They had built a tributary empire. We'll talk about this concept as it relates to China in a later lecture. But what that means is you have the Mexica people themselves, the Aztecs themselves, resided in the city of Tenochtitlan, in the center of the Valley of Mexico, where the city today, modern-day Mexico City, is. In the very fertile Valley of Mexico right here. That was the heart of their empire, that city. But they have ventured out from that city and conquered other neighboring Native American peoples and forced them into a submissive relationship. They forced them in a tributary status where, in order to not get destroyed, annihilated potentially by the Aztecs, they would have to year after year send tribute, something of value to the Aztecs. Even occasionally, or more than occasionally, I suppose, quite regularly, human beings for use in human sacrifice, which had a part in the Aztec religion. Human sacrifice to certain gods that would be performed on top of these temples in Tenochtitlan. The Aztecs would demand that neighboring tributary peoples send some of their own people periodically to be offered up to the gods. It is those people that Cortez encounters first, and they confirm to him, yes, there is a great and powerful and very wealthy empire that we are, in tributary or submissive status to. And while he is sort of trying to communicate with these people along the coast, the emperor of the Mexica peoples, or the Aztecs, Moctezuma, sends a group of emissaries or representatives out to the coast because they had heard rumors of, hey, these hairy, pale people with big-ass ships have arrived from out of nowhere. And we don't know what they want or what they're doing. So Montezuma sends out a group of emissaries to go and meet with these people and find out what they're up to. And so you have this parlay between Cortez and the representatives of Montezuma. When everybody's trying to kind of show off one thing or another, for his part, Europeans, when they come into the New World, they have things that Native Americans have never seen. Like what? Guns, gunpowder weapons, right? So primitive muskets, but also big cannons. And Cortez makes a point to fire the to test fire the cannons in the presence of these people. Now imagine, I mean, even today, like I think about going to the Living History park at St. Augustine, and they fire a little cannon, and you're like, oh, whoa, that's crazy, man, that's loud. Now imagine if you had not only never seen or heard a cannon fire, but didn't even know or could even conceptualize of such a thing. And you experienced it. It terrorized them. It put the fear of literally God into them to see such a thing. What else do Europeans have that Native Americans never seen?
White skin.
That's true. Their very appearance is incredibly bizarre. We read Mexican accounts and I'm like, why are these people clothed head to toe? It's hot here. Their hair is stringy and nasty, and they're super hairy everywhere. And they're so pale. We don't get it. But also, they came in riding on these gigantic deer. Never seen horses before. And not just any horses, war horses, right? Big horses. Steel, too, they had never seen. And not only are the soldiers clad in steel armor and with steel weapons, the horses are too. And so imagine such a terrifying sight as a gigantic horse clad with steel armor and a rider on it with a steel sword or lance and also a firearm. It's been said for a long time that the Mexica, and including the Emperor Montezuma, believed that Cortez was the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl returning to Earth as prophesied in the Aztec religion. Recently, some scholars have begun to suggest that that was not true, and they were just giving the impression that they believed that. Be that as it may, it probably stands to reason that at least some of these people kind of wondered if maybe that was not the case. At the same time, they're trying to impress Cortez, so they bring with them this giant gold medallion of the sun to offer up to him as a gift. And little did they know, that's the one thing you shouldn't have done, because that just cements in Cortez's mind, we're going to Tenochtitlan. We're going to get that gold. It's going to be ours. God, gold, and glory. And so he marches actually into Tenochtitlan. His force, he doesn't have that many men. I think it's only 500 or 600 men. But he's got the guns, and he's got the horses, and he's got the armor and the steel weapons. So they're intimidated enough, perhaps. He literally rides the first time in 1519 into Tenochtitlan unopposed. And meets with the emperor and more or less keeps the Emperor Montezuma as a captive in his own palace. It's as long as you're cooperating with us, we're not going to attack you. And they're like, okay, well, we don't want to attack you exactly, so let's see if we can figure this out. And Cortez is pushing and pushing and pushing for them to basically hand over all of their items of material value. And as the days go by, there are rumblings that why did Montezuma not stand up to this guy? Why didn't we fight this guy? Why are we doing this? We are the powerful, mighty Aztec people. And while that kind of sentiment is brewing for reasons mostly unknown, I think, one of Cortez's lieutenants undertakes a massacre of certain of the Aztec people in a courtyard, an enclosed courtyard where they're undertaking a religious ceremony that maybe just sets this guy off. And he and some of the Spanish troops literally bludgeoned and stabbed and sliced to death men, women, and children in an enclosed courtyard from which they could not escape. That sparks an uprising of the Mexica people, the Mexica warriors in the city of Tenochtitlan that rise up together and drive Cortez and his force out of the city. Cortez is driven out the first time in 1519. However, he goes back and encamps with some of those tributary state people, especially the Tlaxcalans. You don't have to have that name. And over the course of months and into over a year, he rebuilds his force, gets resupplied from Cuba, and he ends up talking to the leaders of these tributary state people and going, man, those Aztecs are real assholes, aren't they? Yeah, I know they made you send your sons for sacrifice, and they clawed out their beating heart from their body and rolled their bodies down these temples, all in the name of their religion. And they've, subjugated you and impoverished you. Yeah, we hate those people. Hey, well, guess what? Cortez says, I'm going back. Don't you want to come with me? I'm going to try again to conquer Tenochtitlan, and I'm not going to walk in friendly like this time. We're just going to go attack. Don't you want to come with me? And so think about, in 1519, Cortez had some advantages. Guns, right? Gunpowder weapons. Cortez had steel, weapons and armor. Cortez had horses. The one advantage Cortez and the Spanish did not have in 1519 was numbers. They were outnumbered. When he comes back in 1521, he has that advantage too, because he has thousands of Indian allies. People who have been subjugated by the Aztecs that he brings to fight with him against them. This would be a quintessential example of the divide and conquer strategy. Divide the Indians, get the ones who have been subjugated on your side, and take out enemy number one, the Aztecs. Does that make sense? And it works. Now, something else had happened, and this is going to be important for our discussion of the Columbian Exchange. We're talking about things that had never existed in the New World, like horses, right? And technologies like steel, or ideologies like the Christian religion. We could talk about, plants that Europeans bring into the New World that had never existed there, that Native Americans had never seen. But there's something else Europeans carry with them everywhere they go. And when you read the Mexica accounts of these encounters with the Spanish, and particularly the one in 1521, they say when the Spanish returned, there had been, in those months while they were gone, the outbreak of a great rash among our people, who were greatly afflicted, and thousands had died. What are you talking about? Smallpox. Everywhere Europeans go, they carry with them diseases. And they lead to great outbreaks that are extraordinarily deadly, especially for Native Americans. And so add that to the list of advantages. When Cortez comes back in 1521, Tenochtitlan is in the midst of a massive smallpox epidemic. And needless to say, this time the Spanish are victorious. They take the city, the Aztec Empire is toppled, is no more. Montezuma is eventually killed, and what had been Aztec wealth is now firmly in the hands of the Spanish. Tenochtitlan becomes Mexico City, and it becomes the great capital of New Spain. And the jumping off point, the base of operations for all further explorations of the New World. And there were, of course, more rumors. Oh, did you hear there's another empire down further to the south, way high up in the mountains of South America? That turned out to be true. The Incas I mentioned. Hey, did you hear further to the north somewhere there is a great El Dorado, a city of gold somewhere? The whole city's made of gold. Not true. That's like Prester John. That's bullshit. But they didn't know that, and they were going to figure it out one way or the other, right? And so you have these many, many voyages of exploration from other parts of what's now become the Spanish New World. You have the Spanish explorer Coronado, who marches north through the deserts of what is today Sonora, the Mexican states of Sonora and Chihuahua, and into what's nowadays Arizona and New Mexico and Texas. Does he find an El Dorado? Does he find another wealthy, powerful Native American empire civilization? Finds a lot of desert. He does find some people living in that desert, and he finds mountains. There's some people living in those mountains, but yeah, that's it. So those stop round about here in what's now the American Southwest. Francisco Cabrillo explores by sea up the west coast of what's now Baja California, Norte and Sur, and up into what's now the American state of California. No wealthy empires, no El Dorado, no highly advanced civilization. So those go no further than here. You have the Spanish explorer De Soto, who explores the Florida Peninsula. Florida, which what they name it, the Flowered Peninsula. up through what's now Georgia and Alabama and Mississippi. No El Dorado, no powerful empire. That journey was an extremely murderous one. Basically, DeSoto's policy is see people, murder people, which of course, that is the way that Native Americans then respond to DeSoto and his crew. So I don't remember the numbers, but like by the time they sail down the Mississippi River and back into the Gulf and go home, like not only is DeSoto dead, but like most of his expedition were. And they had done their part in killing quite a lot of people as well. Who's the other Spanish explorer that's all up and down the east coast of Florida, leading eventually the establishment of St. Augustine as a permanent Spanish settlement? What, you guys ever spend any time in the city in Atlanta? You in Midtown, you want to ride out east to Decatur? Ponce de Leon, Ponce City Market. Juan Ponce de Leon, who legendarily, supposedly, is obsessed with the idea of finding a fountain of youth. So they established St. Augustine here, and it will serve as kind of a jumping off point for voyages back and forth to the mother country of Spain. So ships, when they come in, will stop at St. Augustine before going further. And then all that gold and silver, the Spanish have these giant ships called galleons that they load them up with the gold and silver, and they would stop at St. Augustine before going back to Spain. And then they plant some missionaries there, because remember, God, gold and glory. And then, of course, down here in South America, Francisco Pizarro does conquer the Inca Empire in remarkably similar fashion to that of Cortez and the Aztecs. And then, as you know, the Portuguese are in the process at that time of conquering and establishing their own colony down here in Brazil. Others begin to get in on the game. First, the French. The French are highly active up here in what's nowadays Canada, up and down the St. Lawrence River Valley and establishing towns like Quebec and Montreal. They end up actually establishing friendly relations with Native Americans there and engaging in a lively fur trade. And they make quite a lot of money trading with the Indians for things like beaver pelts and deer skins that could go back to Europe and be used in the textile industry. The Dutch are briefly active here in what eventually is taken by the English and becomes New York. And of course, the English establish colonies at Virginia here first, and then the Pilgrims and Puritans up here. But that's later. That's like the 1600s. All this making sense? Questions about anything? Image is a rendering of the Spanish entering into Tenochtitlan. It's dried up today, but originally this was a city like in the middle of a lake, deliberately located as such as to harken back supposedly to the legendary origins of the Mexica people. And Mexico City is still in that more or less same spot, but the lakes have dried up. So you wouldn't look at it, we wouldn't Google Earth right now and see Mexico City in the middle of the lake. But you can see the giant war horses and the soldiers clad in steel armor head to toe. The horses clad in armor. They have steel swords, they have steel lances. They're up against people who are fighting with clubs and wooden shields and bows and arrows and such, which are effective enough in conquering everybody else around them. But you have people come in who are more technologically advanced, have the advantage of horses, have the unknown advantage of diseases that are more deadly for Native Americans, and so on. And that leads us to the Columbian Exchange. So, in terms of this being a terribly misleading term, first of all, it doesn't have necessarily anything to do with Christopher Columbus. It only bears his name because this process is initiated by his accidentally bumping into what others later realize is a new world. That makes sense? Secondly, this is not, let me make this as emphatically clear as I possibly can. This is not a system of trade. Right? This is not a system of trade. Do not tell me that. Watch this. This is not a system of trade. Do not tell me that on the exam or the quiz. I don't know why I did that in like a John F. Kennedy, like Mayor Quimby voice, but Now, trade might be a part of this, a small part. And I'll hopefully explain what I mean by that. What this is an ecological process. You have two worlds. Almost think about it as in two different planets. Prior to that moment in 1492, there had never been any sustained contact between these two worlds. Think about those two worlds as different ecologies. The old world, and let me make this also emphatically clear. What is the old world? When I say that, what do I mean?
Europe.
Yes. And everything else, with everyone else and everywhere else with whom Europeans had contact. So Africa, Asia, those are also part of the old world. Basically, we mean the Eastern Hemisphere, right? Europe, but also Africa and Asia. Those are the old world. That's one ecology, right? Then you have what Europeans realize for them is a new world, the Americas, right? That all clear up to this point? What the Columbian Exchange is the introduction of organisms, of living things primarily from one world to the other and vice versa. We already saw one example of that, horses. It wasn't that Europeans came to the New World and said, here, let me trade you my horses, right? They bring horses into the New World, and now horses exist in the New World. That's a part of this Columbian Exchange. So at its heart, it's a biological exchange that includes plants, animals, and diseases. When I say a biological exchange, I mean exchange of organisms that come from one world and are brought into and exist in the other. And it goes both ways. And when I say organisms, I mean three kinds of organisms: plants, animals, and diseases. All of those are examples of organisms. Living things. And this takes place over time. This is another way you see it as something other than just like a system of trade. That word exchange is so confusing. This is taking place over many, many years throughout the course of the late 1400s and across the 1500s or the 16th century. The introduction of new plants, animals, and diseases from the old world into the new and from the new world back to the old. Now, in addition to the biological part of this ecological process could also include the introduction, yes, of new technologies and ideas. And we've seen examples of that already too. So, let me just give you, I guess, a succinct definition. So the Columbian Exchange then is the introduction over the course of the 16th century. The introduction over the course of the 16th century. Introduction over the course of the 16th century, that's the 1500s, of new technologies, peoples, ideas, technology, peoples, and ideas, and new organisms, including plants, animals, and diseases. Organisms, either comma or open parentheses or open bracket, I don't care. Organisms including plants, animals, and diseases. Their introduction from the old world to the new and from the new world to the old. Everybody got it? Technologies, peoples, ideas, sure, but most especially organisms, including plants, animals, and diseases, from one world to the other. And it ain't about trade. It ain't about, here, I'll trade you my horse for your alpaca. Hell, think if we're talking about disease as part of this, it's not like, hey, let me give you my smallpox and you'll give me syphilis, right? And again, it wouldn't be just that Europeans bring into the New World sugar. Sugar had never existed in the Americas prior to Europeans' arrival. They bring it into the New World, and again, it's not that some European goes to somebody in Brazil and says, hey, Native Americans of Brazil, let me trade you some sugar and you give me something of yours. Europeans go there, colonize Brazil, and plant sugar, and now sugar exists in the New World. Does that make sense? How this is an ecological process and not trade? That cuts both ways, too. Imagine this. Anybody, well, let me just ask. Anybody know what would be foodstuffs common now in the Old World, maybe even that we associate overtly with certain kinds of Old World cuisine that had never existed in say, Europe prior to this? If there was a certain plant, foodstuff, say, almost ubiquitous in Americanized Italian cooking, what would you say it was?
Tomatoes.
Yeah, didn't exist in the Old World prior to the Columbian exchange. If we associate a certain fruit with the state of Florida now, what might that be? Oranges did not exist in the New World prior to the Columbian exchange. If we're talking about foodstuffs, though, the most important for the Old World, the two foodstuffs that that Europeans and Africans and Asians had never encountered before, that they discover in the New World and then bring back, that then over the course of the 1500s and beyond become what we call staple foods, things people rely on from China to Kenya to Sweden to live and eat. Corn and potatoes. The most significant of the foodstuffs discovered in the New World and brought back to the Old are corn and potatoes, which over the course of the coming centuries become essential or staple foods that allow for population growth, especially in Europe, for sustaining a larger population. Hell, think about centuries later when there is a famine in Ireland. It's because of a blight in the potato crop. That's how dependent they were upon potatoes. Well, prior to Columbian exchange, there were no potatoes in Ireland.
What did they eat before?
That's a great question. Grains, probably, primarily. A lot of meat. That kind of thing. So, what else here? I think I have a handy list. And not for you to memorize at all. I mean, after all, we're open note, open book. So if at the quiz I was like, give me the list of yada yada, you just pull the damn slide up, right? So from Old World to New, if we're looking at animals, remember plants, animals, diseases, and our organismal exchange. Horses we mentioned. How about cattle? Cows had not existed in our part of the world. Nor had pigs, goats, sheep, chickens. God almighty, think about how much chicken and eggs we eat in this part of the world. Well, prior to Columbian exchange, there weren't any chickens over here. Going the other way, a little bit less impressive list, but turkeys, llamas, and alpacas, which were like super important for the Incas and people of South America as pack animals and for their wool. Guinea pigs. Plants, though, pretty even down here. So things that peoples of the Old World, that Europeans introduce into the New World and plant into the New World, rice. That's a big one. In fact, rice would later become a huge cash crop down south where we are. That's right, in the Low Country, Georgia and South Carolina. Grown by slaves, of course. Wheat, how about that? Wheat and barley had not existed in the New World. Oats, coffee, and sugarcane and bananas. Things that become big-time cash crops in like Central and South America. By way of exploitation of American corporations, of course, but topic for a later time. And we mentioned oranges, melons, going back the other way, things that are taken back from the New World to the Old. Corn and potatoes are the big two I mentioned. You also look at beans, peanuts, squash, tomatoes I mentioned, cacao, chocolate made from that, and then Europeans had never encountered that. Boy, do they like that. Papaya and avocado. But look at this. It's not just foodstuffs. Tobacco. They take that back to Europe, and man, people love that, and that becomes a huge cash crop for Europeans in the New World, also eventually grown by slaves. That all making sense? Now, these are relatively balanced, right? When we get to diseases, not so. The one disease that we figure Europeans inadvertently brought back with them to the old world is syphilis, which is a sexually transmitted disease, so you don't have to wonder how they contracted it. But look at all the diseases that Europeans brought with them unknowingly, inadvertently, into the New World. Now, we say unknowingly and unintentionally. There are a few isolated cases of Europeans, like intentionally, once they figure this out, like exploiting this and infecting Native Americans. But initially, and more or less, this is not a process they were aware of. Cold, flu, chickenpox, cholera, that's a lot of fun, malaria, typhoid, and most especially of all, smallpox. Now these are, and I know we're out of time, these are diseases that were deadly for old world peoples, for Europeans, Africans, and Asians. But you had a fighting chance. Your immune system had been, over the course of generations, exposed to this. You had a fighting chance. Because these organisms, these diseases had never existed in the New World throughout the centuries, Native Americans had no chance. They had no, what we call, acquired immunity. Their bodies had no acquired immunity. They had very little, if any, chance to fight off these diseases. And so what was kind of sort of deadly for old world peoples is catastrophically deadly for Native Americans and wipes out Native American populations in certain parts of the New World. In the Caribbean, by the mid-1500s, the Caribs and the Tainos, they're gone completely. And Europeans then repopulate those islands with enslaved peoples from parts of Africa. In New Spain, which would include like Mexico and Central America, by I think 1570, 90% of the Native American population is gone, either from disease or being enslaved by the Spanish to work in gold and silver mines. Further north, it could be less bad depending on when and where you were, but even when we get into the 1600s and you look at the landing of the English Puritans in Massachusetts, they encounter villages that are deserted because there have been outbreaks of smallpox when Europeans passed through. And so if we're looking at the significance of the Columbian exchange, staple foods that help the old world grow, diseases that decimate Native American populations, everything about this biological and ecological process works to benefit Europeans' conquest of the New World. All make sense? Questions? Well, thank you for letting me restart and go a minute over. If questions come up, email me. Otherwise, be ready for the quiz, which I said I would post Tuesday, which will stay up probably through Wednesday.